On today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, was Haason Reddick chasing sacks in 2023? Even if he was, I don't think it matters. Mailbag, all that and more coming your way on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Eagles fans? I'm Louie DiBiase, host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Eagles analyst, also over at Bleacher Report. On today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, I get into why, even if Haason Reddick was chasing sacks in 2023, I don't think that's a bad thing and not a reason to trade him to New York. Plus a mailbag edition of the show. We take our questions from our Locked On Eagles family. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. So we heard this today on an interview at 97.5 The Fanatic. Jeff McLean, the Eagles insider for the Philadelphia Inquirer, he was on the show discussing the Haason Reddick trade, why the Eagles did not want to pay him a top-tier contract on the edge, said a lot about his age at 30 years old, how they were paying younger players, but then he got into an interesting part of the story saying that some people inside the Eagles organization, and he mentioned Fletcher Cox by name, alluding potentially to this topic, also maybe some other guys on the coaching staff or the front office, that they felt like some players were, it felt like they were saying they were being selfish, but almost chasing individual accolades instead of trying to make a playoff run, and Haason Reddick was mentioned by name. So Jeff McLean said that he feels like people inside that building thought Haason Reddick was quote-unquote chasing sacks, of course, to get that big payday in 2024. So I have a few thoughts about this. My initial reaction was, so what? That's his job. Like, that's what Haason Reddick is supposed to do. That's what you pay him for. That's what makes him one of the best players in the NFL, is his ability to go chase the quarterback, go chase sacks. That is why he has been maybe, I think, the most clutch defensive player over the last 2 years, not just in Philadelphia, but the entire NFL. So if he was chasing the quarterback, doing what he does best, trying to make plays, even if it was off script and outside the structure of what Sean Desai was calling or Matt Patricia, I don't really have a problem with that, considering many players outside of just Haason Reddick in that building did not trust the defensive coaching staff. They did not feel like Sean Desai and Matt Patricia were putting them in a good position to succeed. So yes, do you want players defying coaches and going outside of what's being called all the time? Absolutely not. Do you want players putting their individual accolades before the team? Obviously not. But maybe at the same time, don't drop back your elite pass rusher into coverage as much as they were down the stretch. Maybe don't put him in the wrong places to succeed when a year before he helped you get to a Super Bowl, because all you had him do basically was pin his ears back and go get the quarterback. So I understand if, look, Haason Reddick on a play action pass is abandoning the contain on the edge, and he's supposed to take the running back and help in the run game, and instead he's chasing after the quarterback. Like, if he was doing that time after time for all 18 weeks of the season, okay, yes, that's a little bit of a problem, but I don't think it was that dramatic. I don't think this was something where Reddick was constantly ignoring play calls, ignoring the staff, being a selfish player. Haason Reddick just doesn't really give me that kind of character. Like, he was one of the best guys in that locker room over the last 2 years. So for me, I think I interpret it as they didn't really trust the coaching staff. Nothing was going right on both sides of the ball, so players were trying to, veterans especially, take matters into their own hands and go out there and make a play. Again, that's not sustainable long-term. You don't want that to be the mindset. But for 2023, given the independent circumstances of that collapse, I don't really think this is a big deal, and it should not justify, if you feel like, let's say you were against the Haason Reddick trade and you heard the story today, and I've seen a lot of fans that are, Eagles first, kind of turn on Reddick a little bit here. I don't think this story is worth suddenly changing your mind if you thought that the Reddick trade was bad. And again, I'm in the middle. I didn't want to trade Haason. I get the logic on both sides. I don't think this is something that should make you completely switch your perspective. So for me, I don't know. I don't really think it's that big of a deal. And even if he was chasing sacks, I kind of understand it for Reddick, right? Like this guy, outside of TJ Watt and Myles Garrett, there has not been a more consistent player in the NFL over the last 4 years at getting to the quarterback where you can count on at least 10 sacks a year. It's TJ Watt, it's Myles Garrett, and it's Haason Reddick. Like those have been the main three guys. Those two players are getting $20+ million a year. They're almost getting paid like a, middle quarterback market contract. Like they're getting paid the most money a non-quarterback can get in the NFL. Haason Reddick has that same production, and he's the 13th, 14th highest paid. I don't remember what the number was last year, but he's severely underpaid. He did not hold out last year after one of the best seasons I've seen for an Eagles defensive player ever in 2022 with 19.5 sacks, including the playoffs. Constant, huge fourth quarter plays. He did the same thing last year when that thumb healed in the first half of the season before all went wrong. And again, he's doing what the team wanted. Like it was a team first approach to play, and he was playing through injury early on too. Like that's really risky for Haason. And so if he was chasing sacks the second half of the year to help him get a payday, like sure, it doesn't look great from a team perspective, but I don't know. I kind of understand it from Reddick's perspective. So for me, I don't know. I'm not going to say this is a non-story, but it's not a justification for the trade. If you feel like Haason should not have been moved, this should not suddenly completely sway your opinion. So that's kind of where I stand with it. Again, I understand the other logic of, McClain mentioned the age. So did Adam Schefter. He was on the Fanatic today as well, pointing to the Eagles wanting to pay players, closer to, their mid-20s that are just entering their prime, choosing Haason Reddick to go and keep Josh Sweat at 26 years old. Haason Reddick is 30, paying a younger player like Bryce Huff, who's 25 and ascending, extending Landon Dickerson. Schefter did say eventually paying Devontae Smith. Like, I get that logic and collecting a draft pick for Reddick, but this should not have been a reason that you chose Haason over those other guys, because in a vacuum, he is a player still in his prime that is much more proven than those guys and is one of the best edge rushers in football. So I don't know. That's where I stand with it. And the defensive line moves forward here, and it's a much younger unit, as we've talked about. I was thinking about it today, like after all this Reddick talk, it is kind of crazy that, just 2 years ago, you had one of the best seasons in NFL history on the defensive line, where this team had over 70 sacks on the year. Outside of the 85 Bears, there's never been a team that's gotten to the quarterback more. And 2 years later, it is crazy how different this defensive line looks. Haason Reddick is gone. Javon Hargrave is gone. Fletcher Cox is gone. Brandon Graham will be gone at the end of this year. Josh Sweat, his future is up in the air. He's only on a 1-year restructured contract. It looks like a brand new defensive line. And, I think it's understandable, right? You can justify why they didn't pay Reddick and why they didn't pay Hargrave. And there's nothing you can do about the Cox retirement or Graham retiring at the end of the year. But it is crazy. That's just how fast things change in the NFL, that 2 years later, a historic unit is almost picked clean. And again, some of it was out of the Eagles' control. Like some of it is smart. These guys were getting older, but I do feel like it was uncharacteristic to let Howie Roseman, at least for Reddick and Hargrave, to let in back-to-back years prime players at such an important position that you value almost more than any other on the roster, to let both of those guys walk, especially just after seeing the run in their 30s that Fletcher Cox had, that Brandon Graham had on the offensive line, that Jason Kelce had, and Lane Johnson. It's crazy that line is gone. But I think Howie Roseman is seeing the current cycle of life on his roster, where the offense is, they're all entering like the middle of their prime. On the offensive line, Jordan Mailata and Landon Dickerson, Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, like Dallas Goedert. Those guys are in the middle of their prime. They're on those second contracts. There's a lot of money invested in the offense. I really think he's going all out on the defense when it comes to making that unit young and inexpensive, like taking top draft picks on rookie deals while the offense is getting all the money. I think that's really the approach, and it's why he let Javon Hargrave go last year. It's why he let Haason Reddick go this year. and chose to replace them with a Jalen Carter, with a Bryce Huff, with a Nolan Smith. And again, those two guys, like, it's very hard to replace them. I don't think they're going to replace Haason Reddick this year. None of the guys on the roster, I think, will be as good as he was over the last 2 years. But I'll give Howie some credit. Like, I think he's replaced them pretty much as well as you could possibly do over a 2-year span. I want to get into a mailbag edition of the show coming up next. Some draft questions from our listeners. Some really good stuff about what they could do at pick 22. Should they trade down? Drafting for need versus best player available. Some linebacker talk. All that and more coming your way right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets this baseball season. Last-minute deals, you can save up to 60% buying last minutes for sports, concerts, comedy, theater tickets, everything near you. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. Plus, again, you can view your seat before you buy, so you know you're getting a great price and a great view. I've been seeing a lot of stand-up comedy lately, thanks to Game Time. Really been on a comedy kick lately. Game Time has got me there. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem our code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's a mailbag edition of Locked On Eagles. Wanted to hear from our listeners. Now less than a month away from the NFL draft. Where is your head at with this 22nd overall pick? Where do you think the Eagles are going to go on day 1, day 2, day 3? You've heard Gino and I do Mock Draft Monday for the last, 10 weeks, talking a lot about prospects. We're really heating up our draft coverage after free agency. Wanted to hear where your guys' heads are at. So let's start with some draft questions. We're going to start here with @NolanBomb69, who writes in, do you think with less immediate needs after free agency that a trade down is likely? And Gino and I yesterday, we did explore scenarios, like if the Eagles move up, what prospects would they target? Who would they target at pick 22? If they did trade down, does that give them more flexibility for like a potential luxury pick for a wide receiver, a tight end, a edge rusher, maybe more of a future need like an offensive lineman, rather than making sure you go get a cornerback? Or, hey, if we trade down, are we more willing to take a linebacker on day 1, which we normally do not see? We actually never see it in Philadelphia. It's happened once ever. It has never happened since the 80s, and in the 70s it happened just one time. Do I think with less needs after free agency, a trade down is likely? Because again, we explored what the scenario would look like, but what's the likelihood of it? For me, I think it's the second most likely scenario. So I would rank it number 1, they trade up for a cornerback or an offensive tackle. Number 2, they trade down if one of the guys they like at those 2 spots is not in striking distance. And then number 3, they stay put at pick 22. Howie Roseman has only done that twice in his career since 2016 as the general manager. Howie Roseman 2.0. He stayed put in 2020 to take Jalen Reagor. Last year, he stayed put to take Nolan Smith. Although, again, he did trade up last year for Jalen Carter, so can't even really count that. So I don't think it's likely he stays at 22. I think he tries to get up for one of those top 3 cornerback prospects, Quinyon Mitchell from Toledo, Nate Wiggins from Clemson, or Terrion Arnold from Alabama, or one of those top offensive tackle prospects as well. If those guys aren't available, I could totally see them falling down the board from range 24 to 32, because I don't know, unless a Brock Bowers falls, the Georgia tight end, or a Jared Verse, the edge rusher from Florida State, that you just can't resist moving off of that pick for 22. That's what happened last year. Howie Roseman even said himself, normally in that scenario, he looks to trade down, but Nolan Smith was available, and that was a guy they had at the top of their board that they did not think would be there. sometimes you just got to be disciplined. And as much as you love to work the phones and trade up and down, that's Howie Roseman's bread and butter. That's what he does. Sometimes you got to just sit there and take a prospect that's just too good to pass up. So maybe a Bowers falls or a Verse or one of those tackles or like a Nate Wiggins, and you just got to sit there and take it. But to me, if they don't trade up for a corner or tackle, I really do think that they will move down and try to collect an extra day 2 pick. It might not be this year, though, because they already have 2 second-round picks. That Haason Reddick, 3rd or 2nd, is in 2026. Maybe Howie says, I want to keep that draft flexibility going, that optionality with more picks every single year. Let's try to get another pick in 2025. I could see that for sure in a trade down. Because again, unless a top prospect that we don't expect to fall does fall in their lap at 22, as much as I like a Cooper DeJean or a Kool-Aid McKinstry or Tyler Guyton, Chop Robinson, I think the difference between those guys at 22 and a caliber of prospect you can get from like 24 to 32 or even a move down into the second round, I don't think the gap is really going to be that significant where you wouldn't trade down and try to collect extra draft picks. Like, what's the difference between, I don't know, taking Cooper DeJean at 22 or Kool-Aid McKinstry at 28? Like, the Buffalo Bills today just traded Stephon Diggs. Maybe they want to do a small trade up to go get a Donnie Mitchell, the receiver from Texas, or I don't know, Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU. They want to move 6 spots up the board. You can move down. Like, what is really the difference between Chop Robinson and Darius Robinson from Missouri? What's the difference between Tyler Guyton and Adarius Mims at the offensive tackle position? Probably not much. So for me, I think a trade down actually, Nolan, is very likely if they do not aggressive and try to trade inside that top, I'd say like 15 to 17 range to go get a corner or a tackle. And I would say keep an eye out for them trying to collect a pick, maybe in the 3rd round this year after they swap picks with the Steelers, getting Kenny Pickett, or trying to get a day 2 pick in 2025. Good question. I would rank it number 2 in likelihood. Trade up is number 1. Trade down number 2. Staying at 22 would be number 3. Sam Mecca tweets in, who's not getting enough attention on day 2 and day 3? Pick 2 prospects for me, 1 on each side of the ball. I'm going to cheat with this question a little bit. I'm going to go with 2 for each day. So 2 prospects I don't think are getting enough love on day 2, and then 2 guys on day 3. 1 player on defense that day 2 is not getting enough love is Oregon corner Kyrie Jackson. And you guys know I love a corner with length that's tall, that has speed. It's why I loved Rasul Douglas back in 2017. It's why I loved Derek Woolen, the Seattle Seahawk, in 2022. That's my kind of prospect. I love those traits. I love that kind of upside. That's what Kyrie Jackson presents, and I think he's being a little bit overlooked. I think guys like Ennis Rakestraw are getting much more hype. I think a lot of those slot corners, like Max Melton, as much as I love his athleticism, that 4.3 speed, I think Kyrie Jackson, when you're looking at boundary corners on day 2, like let's say the Eagles do go with a tackle on day 1 or an edge rusher or a luxury pick like a wide receiver with that position, or a linebacker, I should say, with that pick. If they move into day 2 still needing a corner and you want an outside guy, I like Kalen Carson from Wake Forest, but I think Kyrie Jackson, after the top 5 corners, that's, again, Arnold, Mitchell, Wiggins, McKinstry, and DeJean, I think Kyrie Jackson is my favorite idea on the boundary for the Eagles at pick 50 or 53. And I saw Jim Nagy, the director of the Senior Bowl, actually tweet out about Jackson just the other day that people were saying when Jackson was at Alabama a few years ago, he was the most talented defensive back in a group that had the likes of, again, Terrion Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Jordan Battle at safety, Brian Branch, that Jackson was actually the most talented guy. That's what scouts told him, and I believe it. Not just because Gino's a Ducks fan. Like, I am not a Ducks fan. I love the traits of Jackson. I think the upside would be there where you have him, Eli Ricks, who was also on that Alabama team, and Kyrie Jackson with Ringo and Ricks, like that, and Isaiah Rodgers, and maybe another slot corner you draft. That's a really, really good group of young corners. So I like Kyrie Jackson, and I think there's a receiver not getting enough love just because of how deep the class is. I think Washington receiver Jalen Polk is just so solid. I just think he's going to get open at this level. Like, is he elite in any one way? No. but he's got really good fluid route running. He can play inside, he can play on the outside, really good hands. He is not undersized. Like, he is a strong receiver. Again, like, that Washington team was stacked, and he didn't have to be the number one guy. But Jalen Polk gives me, like, I don't know, Tyler Boyd vibes, where he's just going to come in right away and just make plays. Like, he's going to be a solid 700 to 900 yard receiver year in and year out, where he's going to be a really good number 2 or a high-end number 3 receiver in the NFL. Jalen Polk from Washington, I really like. So I'd say those are the two guys not getting enough credit on day 2. Oregon corner, Kyrie Jackson, Washington receiver, Jalen Polk. On day 3, I'm going to go with 2 different positions. I love Missouri linebacker Teron Hopper. He's undersized for a linebacker, probably would have to put on some weight here and some strength to play on all 3 downs, especially against the run, to shed blocks and not get eaten up by guards at the next level. Kind of built like a safety right now. But in the modern day NFL, the more important thing for a linebacker is to be able to cover in space, to be able to make up ground with speed. That's what Hopper does best. And he does have the frame where he can put on more weight. I think Hopper is going to be somebody that falls more into rounds 4 through 5. And I think that if a run on linebacker goes and you want an athlete and the Eagles want to wait a little bit and just add some competition for Nakobe Dean-Devin White, but not like guarantee a starting spot like an Edgerrin Cooper would, I think Teron Hopper from Missouri makes a lot of sense, and he's being a little overlooked right now. And then on offense, I'd say Kentucky running back Ray Davis. If there's going to be a guy on day 3 that a team steals at running back, every year a late round pick becomes a stud. And I'm not saying late round like Ray Davis is going to be a 6th or 7th rounder. He's probably closer to maybe a 3rd rounder, a day 2 pick, but I think more of an early day 3 pick in the 4th or 5th round. Ray Davis has the size, the physicality, and he is such a natural receiver. Like, when you look at just at the Senior Bowl, who had the best hands at running back? Marshawn Lloyd was up there from USC, but I think it might have been Ray Davis. Like, very soft hands, can catch outside his body. He's built pretty stout. Like, he's a smaller running back, but he's very, very built. He's put together. I really like Ray Davis. If the Eagles want some power to complement Saquon Barkley and Kenneth Gainwell, I like Davis from Kentucky. Let's continue these questions coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Some questions about need versus best player available, linebacker talk, all that and more coming your way. We'll be right back. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. The sports calendar is loaded right now, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action, because right now, new customers, you get $200 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 back if you can use to bet on the tourney, the MLB, the NBA playoffs are coming up. Same with the NHL, so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make your first bet a big win. Plus, the NFL draft is coming up. We know there's going to be props for that. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and we thank FanDuel for sponsoring the Locked On Eagles podcast today. All right, Eagles fans, let's roll on right here on this Locked On Eagles podcast, Wednesday edition of the show. It's a mailbag edition of the pod, and some really good questions already about underrated players on day 2 and day 3 of the draft. Talking a little bit about a trade down scenario on day 1 in the first round. Let's continue on here. Some questions from Ed Holinsky. Do the Eagles need to take need or best player available? Which approach should they take in the first round? I don't see it as black and white as others do when it comes to, some people always just, they're on their high horse. You never draft for need. Always take the best player available. Regardless, that's how you reach and you get busts like Danny Watkins and blah, blah, blah. Like, I understand it from a certain perspective. I also am not somebody that says you should just take need. Like, we need a cornerback. No matter what, they should take a corner. You guys have heard me complain about corner for months now and saying how badly they need a guy. But I'm not saying take Ennis Rakestraw at 22nd overall. I'm not saying take Renardo Green, the Florida State corner, and reach a round or 2 early. Like, it's not that black and white where you do one or you do the other. Nobody does that in the NFL where they just draft for need, where they just draft the best player available. Everything plays a part in the process. Like, positional value is a part of this. Depth of the class at certain positions, long-term pieces of the position that you already have in place. You're not going to take a receiver best player available if you have 3, like if you're the Houston Texans and you've got Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs, and Nico Collins. You're not going to take a receiver. You're also not going to take a safety who's 2 spots ahead of an offensive tackle if you need both, because tackle's more important. Like, again, positional value plays a part. The depth of the class, like if there's not a lot of safeties you like, but there's a ton of running backs, maybe in the third round you go then with a safety instead of a running back because the drop-off isn't as significant. All of this plays a part. Need does play a part. Best player available absolutely plays a part. It's just not as black and white as some people on draft Twitter will tell you that it is. And yes, it's irresponsible for me or anybody to say you should take a cornerback because you need one that's 10 spots lower on your board than, let's say, a tight end or a defensive tackle that you might not need as much immediately as a corner. Like, you shouldn't reach on need, but I also don't think it's responsible to take a wide receiver who's only 2 spots higher on your board than an offensive tackle because that receiver is the best player available. Again, like if you have a logjam at a position already and you have long-term building blocks there, you're not going to force BPA. Like, what if a quarterback is the best player available and you have Jalen Hurts? You're not taking a quarterback. That's not how teams operate. Every single year you can point to picks and say, that was a need. That was a need. If anything, again, it's not black and white, but if I had to predict or if I had to say what teams do more, draft for need or draft best player available, they draft for need. So that whole narrative, that statement that's thrown out there every single year, I just think is really incorrect. So it's a really good question, and I don't think there is a specific answer. It's not a one or the other. I think there's so much that goes into it, and I think it's a little bit of both. All right, another question here from Khaled Ahmed, who writes in, how are you feeling about linebacker a few weeks after digesting the Devin White signing? And you guys heard me when that signing broke. I did a show that night and said, look, I think Devin White has a lot of speed. He presents high upside. Like, him and Nakobe Dean present a really high ceiling compared to what you've had, but proceed with caution. It's a 1-year deal with almost no guaranteed money. Devin White last year got benched. Like, he has not been the 5th overall pick, 2020 All-Pro stud that he was back then in years. So is this the immediate fix at linebacker? I wouldn't say so. Does it stop them from drafting an Edgerrin Cooper or a Peyton Wilson or a Jeremiah Trotter Jr. in the 2nd round? Absolutely not. But I will say I've had some weeks to process this, to watch a little Devin White tape, and just to think about the position a little more. And I will say I'm a little more excited than I was a few weeks ago. Like, Devin White, again, the floor is very low. He was not good last year. But the upside is there. Like, the Eagles have not had a player of White's skill set at this position in such a long time. Like, when can you say they've had a talent just from, a perspective of physical gifts, a 5th overall caliber talent? They have not had that in linebacker in so long. So when you look at that, him and Nakobe Dean, I think really is the highest ceiling that you've had at this position in a very long time. I'm not saying they're going to be TJ Edwards and Kazir White of 2022. They could be a lot worse than that. The floor of those two players is so much higher than it is with Devin White, who was benched last year, and Nakobe Dean has not played almost any professional football and has been injured for an entire year basically, and the year before was redshirted, so he's such an unknown still. But when you consider that one was a 5th overall pick that at the NFL level has proven it. He's not just a 5th overall pick that was a bust. Like, he was very, very good the first few years of his career, and he helped the Buccaneers. He was a main piece of that Super Bowl championship team. When you add that on top of Nakobe Dean, who was a top 2 linebacker prospect in the 2022 NFL draft, that is more upside. That is more talent than you've had at linebacker in a very long time. And you could say that, sure, that's the Davion Taylor logic too. Like, Davion Taylor was a 4.4 speed linebacker that had all the traits in the world and he was a bust. Like, sure, I'm not saying that Devin White and Nakobe Dean are the fix. It's a much riskier approach than what you've done in the past, but I kind of like the upside. I like that they're going for the talent and they can still take somebody in the draft. So I'm actually more excited about it. I think Devin White, in a new defense, a new environment, if Vic Fangio puts him in the right positions to succeed, if his effort is better against the run and he's not just freelancing it as much as he did last year, he could be in for a payday in 2025. I think it's very boom or bust. So you probably need to have an insurance policy in the draft or go out there and bring back Zach Cunningham, who was really solid for you last year as a guy you got in August, coming off the streets, played pretty good football, all things considered. You got to have an insurance policy, but I will say, this is a good question. I'm much more excited than I was a few weeks ago. That I've had some time to think about it, and I haven't really changed my stance, but I think it's going to be fun to watch if those two guys can reach that potential. It's a fun group for sure. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow and Friday for 2 more shows. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day, Monday through Friday. I'm going to sign off for now, though. As always, thank you so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go, Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.